Hello, everyone. Welcome to this session of our new webinar, which is not actually so new. We're now like 3 weeks in. Seasons of Responsibility. It's about environmental engagement and climate change, and looking at this in the lens of this season from late winter to early spring. I know for many of you, this feels very much like very mid-winter right now. And we have some technical difficulties. Everyone in New York is working from home, so connectivity is a little bit different than we anticipated. But which one of our speakers today, Rabbi Urbach, will be speaking from her. She's going to keep her camera off to make sure that we can hear her because we were having some connection issues. I want to thank you all for joining us on this snowy day if you're in New York. And we're continuing, as I said, our conversation on seasons of responsibility. These are interreligious conversations on environmental justice and repair. I want to thank my partners at the Milstein Center for Interreligious Dialogue for connecting us with wonderful partners, including today's partner, Endy Moray, who is from Fordham Law School, and I'll give her a more exhaustive bio in a bit. But I just want to say that one of the things that has been really nice about establishing this series is we put this kind of big framework out to a number of different interesting thinkers in many different frameworks. And so when I placed this question about the season, the holidays, environmental responsibility, Endy came back with this kind of question of authority and the Book of Esther and law and justice in the Book of Esther. And when I got to be part of hearing Endy and Jan starting to have this conversation, it was really interesting to me that the framing of the Book of Esther was totally different for these two very brilliant people. And I'm really excited for you to get to be part of this conversation. And I'm excited to see where it goes because I feel like I've heard part one and part two, and now I get to see the kind of development here. I want to thank our sponsor, Len Wasserman, for his generous Navi level donation. And this is in honor, he's been a committed JTS supporter for years. And it's in honor of Chancellor Shuli Rubin Schwartz, Rabbi Jan Urbach, and Joan Goodman for their service to JTS. Thanks to everyone who made a donation for the series. If you'd like to make a donation, it's still possible. My colleague Tani Schwartz-Herman will put a link in the chat. And again, thanks to everyone for being part of this learning community. Today, we're going to be looking at law, agency, and ecological responsibility, a Catholic-Jewish conversation drawing on the Book of Esther. And we have two speakers. As with all of these sessions, there are two people in dialogue about big issues related to this season and the environment. Today, Endy Moray, who is the director of the Institute on Religion, Law, and Lawyers' Work at Fordham Law School and an adjunct professor of law, will be sharing her perspectives. She is a Brazilian lawyer with extensive experience in interreligious and intercultural dialogue. And at Fordham, she works closely with students to foster opportunities for multi-faith and multicultural engagement. She's going to be speaking with Rabbi Jan Urbach, who is the founding director of the Bloch Kolker Center for Spiritual Arts. She brings her passion for prayer and teaching to the JTS community. Through her work as the director of the Bloch Kolker Center for Spiritual Arts, she's developed and overseen programs and discussions and prayer services and festivals. And I happen to know that she is a Purim expert in that if you go online, you can check out the JTS Purim spiels from years past. And Rabbi Urbach plays a starring role in many of them. Prior to becoming a rabbi, and one of the reasons why I particularly asked her to do this session is that she was a lawyer. So I'm interested to hear both the perspective of people who are deeply engaged in religious life and legal life in discussion here. There's going to be time for questions, I think both during and at the end of the program. You can send your questions to me via chat. Also, your technical questions can come to me as well. And I want to thank my colleague, Tani Schwartz-Herman, for helping out. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Endy and Jan. Oh, I have to ask them to unmute. I'm very sorry.
There we go. Thank you. Thank you. So I want to first of all, Andy, it's been so wonderful to have this opportunity to look at this text that is so near and dear to my heart and so familiar to me, or so I thought, from an entirely different perspective. And as Ellie said, I want to pick up where you left off, Ellie. That I have to say that when I first heard that or was asked about approaching law agency and ecological responsibility through the lens of the Book of Esther, I did not see an immediate connection, because as a rabbi, as a Jew reading the Book of Esther, the book is so deeply associated for me with the specifics of anti-Semitism, right? With the specifics of the planned genocide of Jews by Haman, and beyond that, it's become associated with sort of the randomness of life, of the sense that this king who is just not paying attention signs this decree. And what does that mean for us? But you came to it with a completely different perspective. Then once you said it, I was like, oh yeah, that's right too. So how did you approach this book as, coming from a Catholic tradition different from mine?
Yes, absolutely. First of all, thank you for the invitation, Ellie. Jem, I'm so really grateful to have you as a conversational partner. It's been really great to develop all these ideas together. And in fact, getting into this point from the very beginning, right? How do we get to a place where the Book of Esther is totally connected to ecological responsibility? And for me, seeing the world, there's a bit of context, right? Marked by injustice, conflict, uncertainty. And looking into Esther from a Catholic perspective, my reading was and is of a prophetic model of prudent, prayerful advocacy for the vulnerable amid power, amid conflict, no, but power asymmetries, lots of it. That's her context as well. And there is a connection also in the way that Catholic tradition sees Esther. So we, in a sense, as you mentioned, right, the connection with anti-Semitism, Esther's defense of the Jewish people, but also here, then we make a connection with the church's mission to the entire human family and the idea of a human family, right, in itself, which is pretty much connected to Catholic social teaching, framing humanity as interconnected. So, quote unquote, we are one human family, we are brothers and sisters, keepers, wherever they might be. So in this sense, there is this connection already. And then there is a second layer still that's a bit more, almost, I would say, bit away from my comfort zone in the legal realm and analysis of agency and responsibility. But also in Catholic tradition, Esther is viewed as a prefiguration of Mary, the mother of Jesus, in her particular role in being this advocate. So she advocates before this powerful king. So mirroring Mary's intersection at the wedding at Cana. So the church fathers explicitly also draw that connection, seeing Esther's bold approach to the king, risking even death, as foreshadowing this Mary's maternal mediation with Jesus. So there is also that connection, though that is already a stretch from my own expertise, since I come here as a lawyer, not really as an expert in scripture, but or theology for that matter. But that there is also that. So then I really come to this conversation thinking, one of the first conversation I had with Ellie, she posed really the idea of the seasons and what we are living, and we as Catholics are living Lent period right now, which is also a period of renewal, of prayer, of fasting, and exactly to see then our also way of being in the world. And immediately from there, that conversation tie in to ecological responsibility and our responsibilities towards the earth. The connection was, I mean, it was right there. So I understand it was also not only you, Jim, because I also talked with a friend, a Catholic friend, and I said, oh, I'm so excited to talk about the Book of Esther in connection with ecological responsibility and stewardship. And I said, really? Have never thought of it. So you're
So
not alone on that.
so let's since you're a lawyer and I'm an ex-lawyer, as some people say, a recovering lawyer. Let's talk about law, because when we started talking about this, I realized, and it's something that's there in the text that I've noticed and never really knew what to do with. There is an emphasis in this book on law, and it starts at the very, very beginning in chapter 1. We read this is a we are introduced into this scene of excess where there's this royal feast with a ton of drinking happening, and the drinking is said to be kadat by law. Ein ones. There is no compulsion. A few verses later, the king consults those well versed in law. And he asks them, Vashti has, as we know the story, right? Vashti refuses to appear. And the king asks, Kadat, by law, what is to be done by law to someone who does this? So the book opens with this cover of legitimacy and law, right? Everything is according to law. There is no coercion. This is a perfectly legal regime. In what is, in fact, at best, as I mentioned earlier, a grossly irresponsible regime, right? A king who signs an edict and then doesn't remember signing it, despite its enormous impact, who is not really paying attention, right? And so there's that. But also, it is, in fact, a coercive and in some ways oppressive government. The law is oppressive, right? Vashti is commanded by law to appear, according to Jewish interpretations, naked at this big party. It is, right, what we would now say is the objectification of women, but certainly, right, it's oppressive and very much coercive. And when she disobeys, the text is ambiguous about this, but the rabbinic tradition says that the law is the death penalty. So everything is done according to law or through lawmaking. And in a certain sense, as I started to really think about, okay, well, why is that? Why is it set up that way? The book really looks at the limits of law, the inadequacy of law. The king issues at the beginning a foolish edict, right? That is utterly unenforceable about what's going to happen in people's homes, right? So that men will continue to be able to be an authority, trying to regulate what can't be regulated. And then, of course, there's the evil edict that Haman proposes that the king signs off on, with the power of law behind it to slaughter all the Jews. And then the whole book really turns upon a kind of helplessness in the face of the law, the inability to alter an existing law, no matter how unethical or damaging. And the best that one can do is issue a reverse edict, which allows the Jews to engage in self-defense in the most violent, horrific way. And so violence leads to violence. I actually, once in one of my forum spiels, used that moment to think about, right, the challenge of an inalterable Second Amendment that creates, instead of reasonable gun control, stand your ground laws, right? So that if we feel frightened in the world because people are armed, we can fight back. Well, we end up with just a more frightening world and a lot more violence because we're unable to wrestle with this provision that exists in the law in a healthy. Now, I mean, there are lots of reasons we could talk about that, but this is exactly the situation here, right? We have a law and we can't do anything about it. So I was reading this as really, this is about, like law, agency, and responsibility. Law plays a big part in this book.
It does. It does. And I'm here trying to, I don't know, make a distinction, perhaps. Trying to pinpoint elements from the book in itself, the law that Esther was facing, that Vashti was facing in that period of time, and what we are living today, and small differences. I would like that perhaps that would be clear. The broad distance that we had in time would have made a large difference also in law. But there at least one, right? I'm hoping that in a democratic system, there would be less of a king coming up and having the ability to just issue a decree that is like so harsh, and then that he doesn't even realize that he had done it due to whatever circumstance. So we would think, well, perhaps today in a democratic system, we would be a better protected with laws that are passed through a number of systems and politicians that there are our representatives and therefore will vouch for our own interests. And there will be much more of a discussion on to what becomes law. So that is just like one, that was actually the point that I thought, no, perhaps today is far from what it was. But now that I'm talking about out loud, I'm actually thinking, is it really? Or are we still dealing with the same type of temptation, in a sense, going back to using a religious word, of just having one person issuing law? Because law, then the limits that I can see that continue to be the same, right? And war and are obviously limits of the law. Law is rigid in itself. It's not that you have a regulation and all of a sudden that is flexible. No, it's rigid because what is written is supposed to be followed. So there is a certain rigidity. And if the system doesn't really allow for not only to be contested, but also to be reflecting the values that that given society has, it's really problematic. In the name of the law, obviously, horrible things were enacted and done throughout history, right? Including
Right.
the story that we are talking about today. The other point in the Book of Esther is irrevocability, the fact that the edicts cannot be reversed at all. And so then you have to work around it. And so that's the reason for the self-defense edict that just
Right.
generate even more violence, because there is not a way to remediate the first edict in itself. So this irrevocability also, it is another limit besides the vulnerability to abuse. What if the king, what if the Haman, it's not a virtuous person, or any other lawmaker for that matter, the possibility for manipulation and the amplification of injustice, it's huge.
Right.
Law is almost prone to corruption, right? In Haman's abuse for genocidal ends, you can see that it's literally enabling unchecked spread of violence.
Right. I would say also, it's not the challenge or the rigidity of the law and the difficulty of the law, the limits of the law, isn't only about the risk of an authoritarian, right, of a king, as we have in the story, or um, the irreversibility. It's also the slowness of legitimate legal process and inability to respond. So, right, like we see an emergency and there isn't an easy way to fix it. Um, and sometimes I think we can feel helpless in that moment. What I find fascinating about Esther here is the moment when she does stand up to the king is a moment in which she acts contrary to law. And she says that specifically, but it's not lawlessness. It's more along the lines of civil disobedience, right? That I know I am violating law here, and there is a risk that I will have to pay the price, right? Because she says, right, everyone knows that if any person enters the king's presence without having been summoned, there is but one law, the death penalty, unless the king essentially grants grace and extends the scepter. And she says, and she hasn't been summoned. So she has to step up and take the risk that the full force of the law will come down upon her. As it turns out, obviously it doesn't. The king extends his scepter. But I think I don't think it's meant to say we should be lawless, but that when the system is locked and there's no, and the paths to changing law are blocked, there is a certain courage that seems to be required in civil disobedience.
Yeah, I would say that another limit of law, which is probably a good one because it leads exactly onto what you're saying, is the inability to address the deeper moral realities that one right? So in this sense, since law can constrain the external behavior, but cannot compel you to change who you are and the way you think about things. So there creates a space where actually the person, the citizen, enters and have a space to really humanize what is just the letter of the law that might be rigid, that might be facing a difficult process for change. But still, then each of us find a space. Might not be an easy space and an easy path to walk towards change because change is never easy. In fact, going back to seasons of what we are here in the vast broad theme of our series, if I think about Lent, we have 40 days to reflect, to think, to fast. Why? Because if we are seeking transformation of oneself, that transformation needs time, requires time. Same if a person decides that, okay, I have a moral responsibility to do something because this law is not really creating whatever end that should be a better end than what is seeking right now. That path will not be easy either. That will require courage, as you were saying. That will require perhaps civil disobedience, depending on the situation. That might be the situation of a whistleblower. In another case, there are many ways, but all of them literally require the action of the person that says, okay, that's the limit, but I need to do something here. And here is a decision to make, right? It's an individual decision to make.
So that sort of shifts my thinking in another direction. Ellie, I wanted to just make sure, are there questions you wanted to pose before we shift gears a little?
And I think the one question I have at this moment is more from this perspective. It's a little bit in that framing of how we as Jews see the book of Esther and how Catholics see the book of Esther. One of our participants wanted to know about the Greek translation that has parts of Esther's that is found in the Catholic tradition, but not in the Catholic Bible, but not in Jewish Bibles, which actually does mention, and according to this, and this is not any place that I have expertise, and this might not be where you guys have expertise, either, but does speak to the kind of difference in where we're coming from. According to him, the Hebrew, as we know, does not mention God, but this Greek translation has God in it. And I guess the question is, like, if we're not, it's not more, it's more of is there anything A, you'd want to say about this? And B, does this, does that framing, and I know we're going to talk about God a little bit later, does the framing of if God is present or God is not present in the book change kind of the thinking about it?
I personally, I don't think it changed it, and I'm coming from also perspective that is not mentioned in the text. In fact, more as Mordecai faithfulness in the idea that we will act in this faith and belief of God's providence that will come up a result that we're expecting, but not necessarily this direct involved into the actions that we are taking right now in this collaborative relationship that he has with Esther. So that's where I'm coming from.
So I would say this is definitely not my area of expertise. But to me, it makes an enormous difference whether God's name is mentioned in the text or not. And I'll explain in a little bit why, in this context, why I think it's an important feature and really essential from a Jewish perspective. I think the absence of God's name is essential to the meaning of the text in a couple of different ways. In a pietistic reading, it's about faith, right? It's about recognizing that God is absent beneath the scene, behind the scenes. And we're meant to intuit God's protective presence, even when it's not apparent. So when the king's sleep is disturbed, that reference to the king, Hamelech, is understood to be a reference to Hamelech, the king God, right? That's a pietistic reading. Another reading in terms of the absence of God's name from the text is that this is an experience of what in Hebrew the rabbis call hester panim, the hiding of God's face, which usually refers to times of that feel very threatening and tumultuous and scary, right? That where we sense that we are living in a time where, however one imagines God is not present on the scene. But the question actually brings me right to where I was thinking of transitioning, was in response to our discussion about law, and that is that I think this book really sits in the question of systemic thinking and our agency as part of a system. So systemic thinking, as I see it, manifests in the text in a number of ways, right? The book begins with this description of extreme royal excess, of these months of partying at great expense with wine and food flowing, and right, all this luxury, excess, and conspicuous consumption is most of the first chapter. And hidden just toward the end of chapter 10, there's one line that refers to the king imposing a tax, both on the mainland and all the islands, right? And the overall thrust of the book is like, yes, and this has direct implications in the realm of our ecosystem. Yes, you can engage in this extraordinary excess and conspicuous consumption. Eventually, the price will be paid, and it will be paid by the entire society, right? That this excess here by the king results in a tax having to be levied on the entire nation, right? So that's one sense of systemic thinking. Um, the second is this sense of the whole fear of Vashti's disobedience in the first chapter is expressed as the concern that it will set a precedent, right? That others will follow suit and women will start disobeying men, and the whole system of patriarchy will begin to crumble with, God forbid, right? Like that's terrible. So there's at least an awareness of systemic thinking. But it comes back to the question of the absence of God's name from the text, because if we put the pietistic read aside, that God is working behind the scenes, we can read instead that this is a book that's saying there isn't going to be a deus ex machina to come and save us, right? This is not a situation or it's a response to the great man theory of history where we wait for one hero to step up and fix things. That this is we're living in a system with systemic issues that need systemic response, and that demands that all of us do what we can in whatever position we're in. This is very much a book about human agency in stepping up, and not just waiting for someone else. And even Esther doesn't act alone. She's especially vulnerable in the palace. But before she approaches the king, she asks the entire community to be involved through a 3-day fast that she and the women with her in the palace will engage in also, so that everyone is acting together. And that, I think, it's precise, like takes us right into that sort of, law, agency, and ecological responsibility, right? That we can't wait for the courts to fix it. We can't wait for God to fix it. We're part of a system.
Jim, I was thinking a lot also about that space that each of us has to act, right? To take an action where we are. And thinking of the Book of Esther through these lenses, then I identified a few, one could say almost a taxonomy, a typology of different types of agents that one could take on. So, for example, I was thinking of Mordecai as a moral prophetic agency when he discovers the assassination plot and advises Esther, refuses idolatrous requests from Haman. All of that is into this moral agency that this is not what is supposed to be. We need to do something. And also prophetic, because at great risk at all in all directions. And you have Esther's intercessory, queenly agency, even risking her life, approaching the king, though she was not summoned, but with a lot of strategy, hosting banquets, right? Trying to find a way to reveal Haman's plot. The same civil disobedience agency and resistance that we could see in Vashti and Mordecai instead. Vashti defying the king in this moment, in this drunken banquet, also risking a lot by refusing to go. Mordecai's non-prostration also towards this royal determination from Haman, who had at the point the power to ask and require, then still refusing. So also there it exemplifies also civil disobedience. Then you have Haman as an example of abusive agents, right? A manipulative agency, someone who deceives, someone who uses. Is also someone who is acting towards his own gain, but is another type of agency, right? Then you have maybe a royal judicial agency in the person of the king and how he maneuvers all these situations. And also the community, the Jews, right? As you said, they were called to fast, to a citywide prayer, and they were all present. So this communal agency as well, not only individual, but there is also this aspect that's also collective. And then you were saying at the end, well, We, through agency, we are called to be the actors of our own history and avoiding the pious, more reading and leaving God behind. But also there, the divine agency might be just the implicit, the providential, that it just could be read on the coincidences, like when the king had this sleepless night. Perhaps there could be also a coincidence. Who knows? Never gonna know, but just saying, there are also a number of ways that we could like also exemplify different types of agencies that one can take. In each of us, we are in different places in society as well, bringing to our reality. So depending where we are sitting and what are the possibilities that we have around us and how we have the chance to gather community to together maybe advocate or really organize or just individually within an institution that we are part of, that might change the way that we look into these characters, the way that we also read Esther, and the way that then in relation to ecological responsibility, we act within these systems. They are protecting or less or not the environment.
Yeah. So uh, I think that raises, first of all, I hear in what you're saying of being a person of faith, right? Of relating to the divine and service to the divine, in reading it not in a pietistic model that God's going to come in and save us, but that God is behind the scenes creating opportunities, right? And one way to live in the presence of God is to be attuned to, where do I have agency?
Mm-hmm.
Where can I be impactful in the situation that I find myself in? Which is not to say, well, I don't have the ear of the king, right? I'm not Esther in the palace. I don't have that kind of access and relational power. What agency do I have? And what does it mean to be sensitive to those moments that maybe it's for this moment that I was created, right? That
Mm-hmm.
this is my moment to do something, whatever, however grand or minute that action might seem to me. Every action has a place, right? That's another theme of the Esther story, is that, the king um becomes aware of Mordecai because of some action that had taken place that Mordecai did long ago, that was recorded in the annals, that he happened to be reading when he was up late and couldn't have insomnia, right? But that action taken long ago, seemingly having nothing to do with saving the Jews now, is the thing that sets something in motion. So we may not know the impact of our actions, but we still have an obligation to act, right? And that
Yes.
takes us to that moment, I think, where Mordecai says to Esther, and this is another way of sort of the systemic thinking, and also coming back to your read of the book, as you said, and thinking of the church as a whole and the human family as a whole, which is a lesson so relevant, I think, to the question of our ecosystem and our responsibility for it. Don't think that if you are silent, you'll be safe in the palace, right? No, someone else will step up and do what's necessary, and you will end up perishing, right? And I think there's a kind of a natural human tendency when we see problems that are so big and so scary, like climate change, to want to just protect ourselves, right? To want to feel like I can keep myself safe in whatever way I fantasize that might be, by amassing enough money or buying a second home somewhere where the climate is likely to move in a positive direction, or in the most, or becoming a prepper and like amassing all this food, or in the most extreme, like buying tickets on a moon launch and thinking I'm going to establish, a new life on a different planet. There's a tendency to want to think, oh, I can save myself. And this is a book that says, yeah, no, that's actually not how it works. Right? Like we're all part of one system. And if you look solely inward and keep yourself safe by saying nothing in this moment, eventually you will not survive.
Right. And I think in that vein, Mordecai's agency as a prophetic resistance, in a sense, it really offers also almost like a roadmap, if you wish, to these big issues. Because in reality, when he asserts his own agency through principled civil disobedience, one could say, refusing to bow to Haman despite the royal command, he is also starting a whole process. And you could start by where you mentioned, right? His vigilance and discernment, in a sense, when he overhears the assassination plot. So this vigilance, then he reports it. Then that later becomes the leverage, the favor, that later is leverage for justice. So also for us, this vigilance to see what is going on where I am at, that can perhaps later create that impact that I'm not perhaps today imagining that will happen. But it is one element, like vigilance and discernment. The other one is moral courage, also public witness, in the sense that when he tears cloths and is there at the gate, and again, right, creating this bold conscience against tyranny. So that is another type of another path that one could take. Exactly. In here is always the same person, but not necessarily for each of us will be all those elements, right? Perhaps another person will follow that specific direction, be more on the organizing, on coming up with protests or whatever that might be, to really come up with new policies or actions that will lead us to a better protection of the environment, because not necessarily also we are bound only by law, right? We can create also actions, also campaigns that we are transforming ourselves and our communities around us. So also here enters the other aspects of Mordecai with Esther, strategic collaboration. He didn't also act alone. He then coordinates all these actions with Esther, and they go together. Here, as you mentioned, really telling her, you cannot just hide in the palace, because what hits me will hit you as well. When I was the other day talking to you, remember when I said that in France these days, this past week, they were registering 35 days of continuous rain that has never been marked since they started gathering data from the weather in France. So there is really nowhere to go. So if you find a place where you can buy the second house that probably is protected, you tell me, because I keep on hearing from all directions that everybody is being affected with different things that they haven't had before. Even my country of origin, Brazil, south of Brazil, has been receiving a lot of rain as well, but also they started having a similar weather as Florida, as the south in the west, with these tornadoes and also manifestations that was not there before. So where do you go, basically, right, to protect yourself? We each of us really need to do something, but I don't see even where we can just hide, unless the billionaires who are building the bunkers and buying islands, but I don't know. Then also there is there is this strategic collaboration, more almost in an institutional level, but there is also communal solidarity, right? When everybody comes to fast, everybody comes to also pray together, this sense of, okay, this is the community, what can we do together? So there is also that as well. And I think all those aspects just pinpoint from Mordecai's experience can be also of light for us today.
Yeah, there are a couple of things that come to mind that I wanted to ask you about in response to this. One is to come back to that moment where Mordecai publicly sits in sackcloth and ashes, right? Like the witnessing that you described. That actually is the moment that motivates Esther to make contact with him. Because presumably Esther doesn't know about the decree, right? That public display causes her to be distressed and to worry, why is he doing this? And she sends someone out to find out, which enables the sermon back from Mordecai to her, right? So I think it raises the question for people who are in those positions to speak to truth to power, or perhaps to have internal influence, and Esther being hidden and needing to needing in this moment to reveal herself as a Jew if she's going to say something. We think about the people, scientists who are at the EPA, right? We think about the decision that individuals make. Do I stay do what I need to do to stay beneath the radar so that I can work from within the system and manage small bits, right? And maybe limit harm? Or do I have the courage to reveal what I know to be true as a scientist, which will likely cast me out of this role? Like, this is my shot, right? Is this the moment to take my shot? Or do I just absent myself and say, I can't be party to this, it violates my integrity, I'm leaving, right? Like, and what role does public protest, the disturbers of the peace, like Mordecai, play in help those on the inside to make those decisions and to have the courage to act on what they believe they need to do? And what's right? I mean, how do we know when to work within and when to risk stepping out?
It made me smile, Jen, because for a while I have been telling my friends, oh, I have been praying for a prophet on modern time, because that's when I mentioned before, right? I identified Mordecai's agency as a prophetic resistance. So I think
Right.
it is more than important to have someone, a voice that just remind all of us that this is going on, and then we are prompt to do something, right? If we're following these moments of vigilance and discernment. And the question goes really then to each person on a sense of it is really up to each one's conscience, right? The way they will react, the way they will act in reply to such an information, let's say. And here, I think it goes directly to also the two different approaches between Vashti and Esther. Also, the book talks about, shows that actually, in a sense that Vashti is that one person that says, well, I need to uphold my personal integrity. That is too much for me, which also requires a lot of personal fortitude because also her life was at stake. So it's not as the same for a person working in a given institution and says, no, that is too much for me, I'm leaving. That is also her life at stake in a sense that could be the salary, the way that you actually pay for your bills. So by leaving, you're also putting a lot at stake as well and risking a lot. So it's not less or more. It's really for each one, right? You're prioritizing conscience over a compromised position. So it arrives to a point that you cannot compromise anymore. So then that's your limit.
Yeah.
But it also, yeah.
Yeah. So I wanted to come back to that question of the prophetic voice, because, this is we have an opportunity coming from two religious traditions. right? And our religious traditions and religious institutions and leaders serving adequately as that prophetic voice? And where where do our respective faith traditions stand on speaking out against authority, on law, against the system as it is? Like I'm curious whether we have similar or different experiences of that within our own faith traditions.
Yeah, I mean, I was just now thinking as you were asking this question about the way the Catholic bishops um, had spoken or not in different issues lately, and there was an article that I received literally identifying some bishops really speaking out what they thought was not according to Catholic tradition in the protection of human dignity. And the article in the end was saying, what about all the others? Because we are here listing those who have spoken, but there are so many other bishops out there. Why are they not speaking up? So I think we have in my tradition also goes the same idea that I just mentioned before, right? It goes to what each person, even in a position of authority as the bishops, what they decide in their conscience that they have to do and how they have to act. And if that action, it is through speaking out and being public, giving a public statement or doing something else. And that something else could be a number of things, including work within their own communities to address that very same issue that maybe others prefer to have like that public voice. So I think we have all kinds of answers as much as any individual from the people, from the lay community that are not part of the clergy. I don't know if I
Yeah,
answered your question.
I mean, I think, from a Jewish perspective, obviously there are multiple voices within Judaism that relate differently to questions of authority and law and speaking out against systems. And this is a book that is shared scripture, and that I think does, among many other texts, support the importance of speaking out against systems. And I think, as to come full circle to where we were about how I as a Jew experienced this book and you as a Catholic experienced it differently. I think you're right that it's about more than the need to speak out and save one's own people from, right, to save the Jews from the anti-Semitic threat. It is a book that models the courage to speak out and to have a prophetic voice. And I would say my own interpretation of the book for years has been that one solid way to read this book is that King Ahasuerus should be read as a parody of God. And, this is a book that is comic, it is a burlesque, it is a parody. There are a lot of parallels between the description of Ahasuerus's palace and the tent of meeting, or the Mishkan, or the tabernacle that the Israelites built in the wilderness. There are other echoes in which we might um, um, see God being parodied here, including that famous moment where the king's sleep was disturbed. And we have a psalm that says, "The guardian of Israel neither slumbers nor sleeps." What is the king doing asleep at the wheel? Right? And in that sense, this is a book that, even though Judaism is a system of halakha and law, and right, it is not a system of mindless obedience, even to God. Even to God, right? We have the model of Abraham arguing with God, and the critique of Noah, who follows God's law to the letter and never stands up and challenges the divine decree. God says, "I'm going to destroy the world, and you go, you build this ark and save yourself and two of every species." And Noah says, "Okay." right? And the rabbinic tradition faults him for not challenging God and says, due to his excess humility, right, the world was destroyed. Had he argued, he could have saved the world. So we have that strong impulse to challenge authority, not just the human king, but the divine sovereign, so to speak. And I wonder right now if I shouldn't phrase it that way. I don't wonder. I perceive that the biggest divides religiously in our country right now are not actually between faiths, but between the perspectives in each faith of those who tend toward fundamentalism and an unquestioning acceptance of divine authority, which often translates to a tendency toward unquestionable human authority, and those branches of every faith that really sit in this book of Esther and say, no, like we have responsibilities as human beings to bring our own moral compass to the table, to challenge unjust law, to challenge even unjust religious law, and to work to do what we can um, to speak up when we see issues like the destruction of our ecosystem.
Yeah, I think we're absolutely right, because if I would tell you in a large way, Catholic social teaching, there is no doubt that as Catholics we are called, all of us, to speak up, to be at the forefront in the defense of human dignity, and of all, I mean, thinking about Caritas in Veritate, Laudato Si, Fratelli Tutti, all encyclicals that for years now is being used to explain exactly this type of responsibility, and to call each, and also not only Catholics, but if you think Laudato Si is written to all people of goodwill. So all these encyclicals that are not even limited to Catholics, but really calling everyone to do something. And there should not be a doubt that that should be our responsibility. And yet, certainly there are people who don't see it this way. I mean, the way you were describing, if you were perhaps more like Noah, literally reading a text more literally and staying within those boundaries and just not able to see beyond that. That's why I say in the end, I think it really comes down to a conscious type of response, because each person will then make a decision. And despite all that in Catholic tradition, we have really pushing almost people to be out there and do something and act, literally saying we cannot pass on a planet for future generations that do not have the resources that they need. So basically, we're not respecting their human dignity. So more clear than that, but yet, yeah, definitely there are people that don't see that this way at all. And we are coming, even now I'm thinking about the explanation about dominion and stewardship. We're coming from John Paul II already explaining that even in dominion we have responsibilities towards the environment, towards the people, this connection with God, with neighbors, and with the earth. When those relationships are really not that evident for a person, then I don't think that easily agency towards an advocacy for the protection of the environment, or even of the society in itself, of the poor, of the vulnerable, will come easily to mind.
I'm gonna jump in if you guys don't mind. It's been lovely to listen to you go back and forth. We have a couple of questions, and I just wanted to make sure we had a little bit of time for that. One is about the kind of framing of, we're thinking about human engagement, human agency, and it goes back, Jan, in some ways to your question about systems, that, that here we have opposition to individual decrees, but not necessarily opposition to systemic injustice. And in some ways, Esther, by, going and being part of the system and saying, hey, we can't do this decree, but then they can't do this other thing, ends up morally compromising her position, as we talked about, more violence, the violence begets violence. And so the question here is there a way to be more like less seeing this story as a model, but what would be the kind of implication of seeing this, of how do we stand up to systemic injustice as opposed to just, hey, there's this decree that I'm worried about. And I'm happy to kind of try and clarify if it's too out there as a question.
No, I think, Ellie, am I muted? No, I'm okay. Okay.
Yeah.
No. Okay. I was just here thinking of Esther. If you look at Esther, not necessarily again bounded by the idea of the edict that she is trying to change, or that definitely then the only way was to go around with another one that then generated all the violence, because obviously the first one could not be reversed to begin with. But if you think about Esther integrating that agency not only for herself, right? In a sense, that's the distinction that I see between Vashti and Esther. Right? Vashti was advocating for herself, basically her own integrity she protected. Esther is taking the risk in advocating for herself and the whole community. So I think she integrates this solidarity that I then connect to global responsibility, also an aspect of subsidiarity. So she has a unique role within the system, but she's not allowing simply the state to tell her what she has to do and staying there passive. No, I am here within that system. I have a voice. Actually, I can leverage this voice to produce a change. So I'm going to use it with the risks that of those choices, obviously. So she has a unique role. She's using that role. So in connection to Catholic tradition, I would say that's a clear aspect of subsidiarity right there. Not really just going with the flow, but acting in your own space within the system in order to exert change. And also public participation. I mean, the public witness that we were discussing with Mordecai, but also with the whole community that then prayed, that then fast, that then was engaged in this preparation for her to act, for her to host those banquets, and then arrive into a decision that has an impact in the whole. So I think there is a number of connections there.
So I love that, and I would go in a really different direction and answer this question. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think a couple of things. One is the point you made earlier, Andy, about like there are so many different types of roles here, right? Like when we want to change the system and not just like we do need people to save the day in the moment, to respond to the immediate threat in a very particular way, as Esther did. We're going to reverse this decree. We're not changing the legal system so that, or that decrees can actually be changed. We're not, but we're gonna find a way to combat this particular problem. Mordecai is out there raising consciousness in the public and ends up in a position of great power as a result of what he did there, right? Like he then, beyond the limit of chapter 10, may be in a position later to change the system. But I actually want to read Vashti really differently than you do. And in part, Vashti is such a feminist hero in liberal Jewish circles, and I think it's possible to read her as not stepping up only for her own self and integrity, but really taking a stand that this treatment of women is unacceptable, and I will not be part of it. right? And certainly her action is understood that way by the king's advisors. She's threatening the whole system here. If you let this slide, you're like every man in the country is going to lose their patriarchal authority. So she is threatening the system. She doesn't succeed, but she starts a process. And from a meta perspective, we end up with a book of the Bible that is named for a woman. We end up with an image of queenly power, and Esther's power persists, right? Like she doesn't in the moment change the system, and Esther doesn't in the moment change the system. But both of them, both Vashti and Esther, chip away at it. And systemic change is much slower and harder than fixing one particular threat, right? You can save this national park, but that's not going to change the way we think about the ecosystem. We still have to act to save this national park, right? That's a good thing to do. But each of those steps slowly chips away at the larger system, and we can have both lenses at once. That's Ellie, that's how I would respond.
I love both senses of this. I also think there is this, in order to get to Esther, you needed Vashti. And there
Mm-hmm.
are times that we have to stand up because our own self-interest and our integrity are at stake. So I think
Mm-hmm.
it's an interesting concept all around. I know next week when I'm listening to the Megillah in synagogue, I'm going to have a very different framework for thinking, especially as we get to those final chapters that are often ignored, and thinking, is this what we have to get to in order to what's better, and thinking in terms of what we can do to have more fruitful discussion, um, like these sorts of discussions. I actually very much appreciate one of the things that I think in talking about the Book of Esther is I don't think I've ever thought about it as an interreligious dialogue in and of itself, and it certainly is. It's one of our most ecumenical, diverse books within the Torah, within the Bible, and I appreciated hearing your perspectives on this. As we're wrapping up, is there any kind of final thoughts before we close out for today?
More than any final thoughts, Annie, if I just could conclude these previous ones, because I want to
Sure.
agree with Jam. There is this aspect to Vashti. Absolutely, I agree with that. Also, a signal of prophetic descent. That's probably what was missing for what I said before, and definitely that can inspire others. And in her character, I also see that definitely, and also that she exposes again, and also parallel to us, she also exposes the laws limiting, enforcing dignity and consent, because I mean, zero consent. Okay, let's put in her time and age. That's well, but if we bring to our time and age, that also the consent that she provides for us, I think speaks a lot. Also to an aspect of consent and respecting human dignity. That's for sure. Creating and her removal also created the space for Esther. So definitely for an individual
We need
resistance, you
Vashti to
can
stand up
provoke.
in order for Esther to.
Yeah, you can provoke further down the road another result that it might not be immediately what you're seeking, because of, again, what Jen said, that systemic change, really incremental change, is really slow. Obviously, that if you're doing a revolution, maybe that might be different, but incremental change that require a lot, and requires also, I think, believe that deeply, really requires the whole community to come together, and with each one with their different roles really acting toward a transformation, a change, a improvement, because justice is not an easy task to reach. And again, in the case of Vashti, also shows that even for, if we take her in a sense as a whistleblower, right? Not so much someone just again advocating for herself, but showing how the system is not working for women. Then we have also in our days the parallel to the fact that whistleblowers also not necessarily immediately face what we would expect as justice, right? Many times they face a lot of systemic backlash as well, and suffer and personally suffer from what they are doing. And usually they are doing something that we really need. We need people that tells us how those systems are working or not, so that we can then be able to move on and take action. So I am extremely inspired by this text, and I'm totally biased. So, but by the fact that we have examples, and we really can we can draw from such rich tradition that we share, and so there is much that we could do also interreligiously, organizing and advocating for environmental protection. I think that is really the conclusion for what I come from reading Esther and thinking about law and agency and our responsibilities.
So there's nothing I can add to that. So I'll just close with a religious meaning, being the rabbi, and that is that the Book of Esther is in two respects last. It is in the Hebrew Tanakh, it is the latest book, right? It's put into the Hebrew Bible by the rabbis. It's very late to enter the canon. And liturgically in the festival year, Purim is the last holiday in the cycle, because the holiday cycle, to make sense, historically begins with Passover, with the Exodus from Egypt, and then continues through the year. So whether we think of reading the Book of Esther this time of year as Jews are preparing to think about freedom and agency as the obligation that comes with freedom, or whether we think about the arc of the Hebrew Bible, which begins in chapter 2 of Genesis with the command to care and tend the earth, right? And be stewards. And then the last book to enter is about human responsibility and agency. Either way, we are being pushed by both cycles to really step up and claim our agency to protect the world that we've been given.
Thank you both so much for your time, for your energy, and for your thinking on this. It's a really compelling case, and it really does it changes the way I'm thinking about Purim this year. So I very much appreciate it. Next year, we're continuing. Actually, next Monday is the Fast of Esther, and we're going to be thinking about fasting and feasting with Gopal Patel and Ben Kamine and they'll be discussing Hindu perspectives and Jewish perspectives on feasts and fasts. So I hope you'll join us again. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. And thank you again, Andy and Jan. It has been a pleasure listening, and thanks. Stay warm, stay dry.
Thank you.